All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Victoria Dockett, and we're here to conduct a one-on-one training on the risk and resilience assessment and response plans that are required under Section 2013 of America's Water Infrastructure, referred to throughout this workshop as AWIA. Many of you have already participated in developing an emergency response plan because they're required by many states. Some of you have already been involved in asset management, and others, might be involved in the development of the previous vulnerability assessment back in the early 2000s. But this workshop will help you to take that knowledge and apply it to the new requirement. So welcome. We'll start with some brief introductions real quick. So like I said, I'm Victoria Dockett. I work in the Water Security Division at EPA, and our mission is to enhance the security and resilience of the water sector by providing innovative tools and training. So I'm originally from Florida. I did the Peace Corps for a number of years, and now I'm at EPA, and I'm the project lead for all things AWIA Section 2013. So if you've asked questions before this workshop, you probably already talked to me. Yeah, that's a little bit about me, and now I'm going to pass it over to Jeff to introduce himself, the other trainer today.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. So my name, as Victoria said, is Jeff Fensel, and I've been with EPA's Water Security Division since 2006, starting as the task lead for consequence management under the Water Quality Surveillance and Response System program, essentially working on how utilities should respond to possible contamination incidents that may occur in the distribution system. Currently, I'm working on emergency response related activities under the Security and Assistance branch, which is just a branch under the Water Security Division, including what I'll be working on or talking about today, which is emergency response planning. Prior to joining EPA, I worked as a technical instructor for the New England Waterworks Association, which is a section of AWIA, where I helped to train water operators on a variety of different water-related topics. And today, if you were on the webinar from the New England states, maybe we have crossed paths at one point or another. So I'm looking forward to the webinar today. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Victoria.
All right, thanks, Jeff. Yeah, so this is a remote only workshop given the current situation, but we're going to try to make it as engaging and lively as possible. So with that being said, if you wouldn't mind taking a few minutes to introduce yourself, you'll see you have a GoToWebinar panel, and on that panel you'll be able to see the chat question box, and you can type in there your name, your position, your organization. And then I will call some of those out and get a feel for who is joining us today. And while you are all writing that in the chat box, I'm going to go over just a few administrative notes. So like I said, you will notice that GoToWebinar panel on your screen, and there's a few different boxes on there. So there's one section entitled Handouts, and so in the Handout section you can find an agenda with the information on the breaks and lunch today. So we'll have 2 breaks, one in the morning and one in the afternoon. And then we also will still have that 1-hour lunch period. And in that handout section as well, there's an activity workbook, which contains all the pertinent slides from this presentation for you to revisit if you have any questions down the road. So it might not include a slide like this one, because that's not useful if you were to try to look at this information post-workshop, but it does include all the most pertinent slides in there. Also available to download is a resources document with helpful links, and this will include the incident action checklist for COVID-19 or for a pandemic. So you'll see that as well in the handouts, and then in that resource document, anything that I talk about during this training, the tools and resources that the Water Security Division has created over the years, those will be available in that resources document. Similarly, there's that questions and chat box, which many of you are using right now to introduce yourself. But as we go through the workshop, if you have any questions, please write them in as they come up. We will be answering them throughout the workshop and not just at the end. So please do write your questions as they come up. You know, oftentimes many people have the same questions, so asking that and allowing me to answer it or Jeff to answer it really does a lot for everyone participating. As well, we're going to offer the opportunity to ask your question out loud to us. And so we will message you if you have an audio capability ahead of time, and so give you a heads up in that way. If you would like to remain anonymous when you ask a question, please write anonymous at the start of each question, or you can email AWIA training@cadmusgroup.com, and we'll write that email into the chat box as well. And so you can email that address with your questions to remain anonymous, and we won't read your name to the audience if you indicate this. We will also review questions towards the end. There's a 30-minute section built into the agenda at the end of the Section 2013 workshop, and that'll be like a final opportunity for any remaining questions you might have related to the Risk and Resilience Assessment Emergency Response Plan requirements. I'll also be providing you with my email, so after the training, if you have questions, you can reach out to me. And then just as a note, GoToWebinar is seeing an increase in usage, of course, with many people similarly moving workshops and trainings to remote only. So this increased usage may result in some technical difficulties, but we'll work to address those in a timely manner. We've conducted about 4 of these workshops so far, so we do have experience trying to work around these difficulties, but we just ask for your patience and understanding as we do that. As well, we'll be asking a mix of polls and quizzes throughout the training to keep you engaged and sort of do a knowledge check, so I can be sure that you understand the material I presented to you and I didn't confuse you in any way. And these will appear on your screen, and you can select the button as it pops up, and then we'll show the results about 30 seconds after we open those polls. If you're interested in the continuing education units, please note that they're not guaranteed, as we're still seeking state approvals, although we have many of them. And if you qualify for those CEUs, you must stay for the entire webinar and complete the webinar evaluation at the end. And we will send a message notifying you that that evaluation has opened. It'll be posted in that same handout section towards the end. And with that, those polls and quizzes I mentioned are also a way to inform us how actively engaged you were throughout the workshop, so we do ask that you participate in those. And lastly, if you're attending as a Train the Trainer and plan on presenting this material later on, please let us know in the questions chat box as well, and then we'll follow up with you with any additional information. And so let's see some people who are joining us today. Just give me one moment here. Oh, great. We have a lot of people, so just so you all know, we have Craig Crocker at the COMM Water, Dennis Smith, Superintendent Whitman DPW, Johanna McKenna, Louis Ragazzino, PE, Cheryl Stevens, Project Manager at Draper Aiden Associates, Keith Natasja, Rebecca Paustian, Engineer from Woodard and Curran, David Condry, Manager at Milford Water Company. We have the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services, Drinking Water Bureau, David Klug, State and Local Government, Convergent Solutions, LLC, Jim McKay, Director Millis, DPW, John Freisler, Piqua, Ohio Water. And we have many more. I'm just trying to do a sort of random sample here. We have someone from the Environmental and Regulatory Coordinator for Concord Public Waterworks and Sewer Division, Town of Canton, Massachusetts, Water Sewer Supervisor, Chris Sykes, and many more. So I don't have time to read all of them, but it does help us to get an idea, and I'll continue to look through these as we go. So Thank you again for being with us. Just so you're aware, there's normally a mix of water utilities, some people from a state or tribal agency, and then consultants as well. That normally makes up a good bulk of our attendees. So here's the training outline for today. So I'll cover the first section, which provides the overview for AWIA Section 2013, and then move on to Section 2, which will cover the risk and resilience assessment requirements and the tools that EPA has developed to assist you in conducting your AWIA compliant risk and resilience assessment. So that's going to make up the bulk of the morning. So before lunch, we mostly be me talking. So apologies ahead of time, you'll hear a lot of my voice. But then after lunch, we'll take a little break and then move to Section 3, which is Emergency Response Plan Guidance and Template. And that's where Jeff Fensel will come in and review the requirements, the guidance and template that was developed to assist community water systems. And again, they're AWIA compliant ERP. So after Section 3, I'll come back in and I'll cover the certification process for your risk and resilience assessment and emergency response plan. Then we'll cover the frequently asked questions that we've heard a lot. And that sort of will be a review. So most of the information I'll have already covered, but we'll just review it one more time and answer any questions that have popped up along the way. Before we move on to Jeff Fensel again with Section 5, who will discuss the new requirements under AWIA Section 2018. So that's sort of what today's going to look like for you all. And again, it's just a reminder that you should have that participant activity book and an AWIA Section 2013 fact sheet in the handout section of your webinar panel. So that fact sheet can also be found on our website, which you'll see a link to in that resources document, along with the Section 2018 fact sheet. And this is sort of just for your awareness. You don't need any of these open right now as we go through this, but you might want them after the end of this workshop. But if you didn't receive these materials or you don't see them in your handouts, please write in the chat and question box and we'll help you with that. That being said, we're going to move on to the one poll question, just to help get everyone familiar with what that's going to look like and how that works. So our first question for today is, what best describes your organization? And this just helps us to get a feel for who's attending as well. Okay, great. So we have close to 60% of our attendees are representing a water utility, 17% are consultants, and then 22% are state, tribal, or agency representative. And again, we have 3% of a different kind of attendee, but we welcome all of you and hope you get what you are looking for out of this workshop today. So that being said, our goals for today, we have 3 main goals. And the first one is to understand the requirements of a risk assessment and understand how to use the vulnerability software. And then the second goal is to understand the requirements of the emergency response plan and understand how to use that emergency response plan guidance and template. And then finally, to learn about the new release notification requirements and accessing chemical inventory data. So those are our high-level goals, but we're going to go into detail about each of these things as we move forward. So our first section today is going to be that background on AWIA Section 2013 A through G. And in this section, we're going to talk about the history. So some of the previous law, which was the Bioterrorism Act of 2002, 2013 AWIA. And we're going to talk about specifically who this law applies to, and then briefly about why building resilience to all hazards is important at your utility, and some of the resources EPA has developed to help you address those. And we'll talk a little bit more specifically about an incident that you may face in your region. And finally, I'll provide you with the latest update on funding and the enforcement discretion in place if you do not comply within the required timeline. So many of you probably remember the Bioterrorism Act of 2002, especially those who are from a water utility. So that Act of 2002 added Section 1433 to the Safe Drinking Water Act, which required water systems to assess their vulnerabilities to terrorists or other intentional acts, and then based on that assessment, prepare emergency response plans. So this act was quite focused on gates, guns, and guards. And we say that because it was, again, focused on physical security overall. The statute required community water systems to conduct a vulnerability assessment by set deadlines, submit a copy of that assessment to EPA, and then develop an emergency response plan and certify completion of that response plan to EPA. But it did not require anyone to periodically update those risk assessments or emergency response plans. The vulnerability assessments were meant to identify risks associated with terrorist attacks or other intentional acts designed to disrupt the system. So these are some of the big differences we're going to talk about today. So to start off with, it required that water utilities submit a copy of the vulnerability assessment to EPA. For AWIA Section 2013, and we'll definitely go over this many times, but we are not accepting the assessment themselves. We're only looking for the certification that you've completed your risk assessment and emergency response plan. So during this time, Bioterrorism Act of 2002, this is where the Water Security Division emerged, to help water utilities comply with this law. And we've similarly done the same with the AWIA Section 2013. And with this, EPA was named the primary agency responsible for enforcing this section of the Safe Drinking Water Act. So that's just a brief background on the Bioterrorism Act of 2002, which has some similarities, some differences to the one we're going to talk about today. So one similarity is that this AWIA Section 2013 is an amendment to the Safe Drinking Water Act, Section 1433, and requires, here's one difference, not only the initial risk assessment emergency response plan, but the new requirements includes a recertification every 5 years. So Section 2013 will have recertification deadlines every 5 years, whereas the Bioterrorism Act did not require that. So the old vulnerability assessment is now replaced with the new risk and resilience assessment. And AWIA Section 2013 expands the risk types addressed in this assessment to include risks of natural hazards and malevolent acts. In addition, community water systems are required to evaluate the resilience of their current physical infrastructure, as well as their management practices, which can include financial capacity to respond to these risks. Based on the assessment, public water systems must also develop emergency response plans that address the risks and resilience issues that systems may face. So some of the differences here are it's not just malevolent acts and potential terrorist attacks, but also the resilience to natural hazards as well. EPA is required to provide guidance to small systems who are not required to comply with the certification requirements, which are those systems serving a population of 3,300 or less. So basically, this means that any drinking water system servicing a population of 3,300 and 301 and above are required to comply with AWIA Section 2013. And EPA is still responsible for directly enforcing Section 1433. And this is just a background. We'll go into more detail as the day progresses. But this is the high-level overview of the certification deadlines. So you can see for those considered large systems under AWIA are serving a population greater or equal to 100,000 people, and their deadline already passed. It was March 31st, 2020. So we have passed the first certification deadline. The second deadline for the risk assessment is December 31st, 2020 for those community water systems servicing a population of 50,000 to 99,999. And those are considered medium-sized systems under AWIA. And then small systems are those servicing a population of 3,301 to 49,999. And their deadline is June 30th, 2021. So with that being said, I'd like to take a moment to ask, what is your utility service size? This just lets us know, again, who's participating and maybe help direct the workshop a little bit. Okay, great. So we have majority of small systems joining. So those are going to be the ones that have the deadline of June 30th, 2021. We have some medium systems, so that's that December 31st, 2020 deadline, and then some large systems. And that's great as well because large systems will have the emergency response plan certification due 6 months after that initial risk assessment. So definitely still material to go over. And then 10% don't know. And we ask that question because if you don't know your population service size and your water system, you're definitely able to email me or the DW Resilience inbox email that you'll receive throughout this presentation and ask for your population service size that EPA has on record. So if you don't know, feel free to reach out and we can provide that for you. And then just as a note as well, if you're a wholesale utility, this also applies to you, and we'll cover how your population size is determined in later slides. So the Water Security Division within EPA, again, I already mentioned this, but it started in response to the Bioterrorism Act of 2002, and it later became a division. So it went from task force to division, and in that time, we have been developing tools and resources to assist utilities in becoming more resilient. So to do that, one of the tools we developed is a water resilience framework, and it was developed to help utilities understand the process of building resilience, and this acts sort of like a roadmap. So here are the steps in the framework. Initially, you would start off by assessing risks, so that top circle there. To prepare for emergencies, you must understand utilities' threats and vulnerabilities. The risks that are most relevant to your utility will determine the planning steps that you take. Sample actions would include the now required risk and resilience assessment. And this step in the framework is now required by law for community water systems serving a population size greater than 3,300. So once you've assessed your risks, then you move on to planning for an emergency. And that would involve developing and updating emergency response plans, initiating mitigation projects, and taking any other key actions to reduce the impact of a future disaster. So again, this step in terms of developing emergency response plan is now also required for community water systems serving a population greater than 3,300. And I'm going to keep repeating these numbers because these are the most commonly asked questions. Is who does this law apply to and when? So anyone serving a population greater than 3,300. So once you've developed that emergency response plan, then a utility would move on to training. So just because you have an emergency response plan doesn't mean that staff and the people involved in an emergency understand how to use the plan. So training can involve training staff on emergency response protocols and conducting exercises to practice coordination at the local, state, and national levels. So sample actions here include participating in tabletop or full-scale exercises, for example, and EPA has tools to assist you with conducting this type of training. So after you have trained on any emergency response plans that you have in place, you're going to want to move on to response in the case of a disaster. So if a disaster occurs, you must have the right tools available to respond. So that could be a routine water main break or a natural disaster such as hurricanes or earthquakes. And we have a Response on the Go app that provides an emergency response plan, we say, in your hands. And we'll go over that later today in the ERP section. But many utilities have found it quite useful to have when there is a disaster and you can't necessarily have access to the internet at all times. So finally, a utility will move on to the recovery process if there's a disaster, and that would require having resources available to restore service as quickly as possible. Utilities must work with the right partners to return to normal operations as quickly as possible again. And we have a tool entitled Fed Funds that can help water utilities find federal funding for recovery and mitigation projects. The AWIA section, just to reiterate, the AWIA section 2013 requirements are related to the assess and plan components of this framework. But we've also designed a route to resilience tool that uses brief videos and an easy interface that would guide users, if you were interested, through building your own roadmap, and we'd call it the Roadmap to Resilience report. And those steps to resilience are the water resilience framework we just went over. So assess, plan, train, respond, and recover. And it helps utility personnel to learn what it means for their utility to be resilient and what tools and resources are available. So if you're interested in that, that will also be in the resource document that you receive. So as we prepare for this workshop, we would like you to start thinking of the types of natural hazards and malevolent acts that you might have already faced or might be faced with in the future, and what you'll need to plan for at your utility. So in Region 1, natural hazards might include flooding, winter storms, hurricanes, or nor'easters. And then malevolent acts are pretty similar across the US, and those might include cyber intrusion, contamination, vandalism, or active shooter. So with that being said, we've developed a flood resilience guide as one of the tools in, to help you prepare for a flood, and in the case that that this is an issue that would directly harm some of your critical assets. So I'm going to play this for you. Just a moment.
Surviving the flood, assessing flood risk, and increasing resilience. Berwick, Maine.
Part of EPA's mission is to help water and wastewater utilities build resiliency to disasters. Resiliency means the ability of that utility to maintain operations during a disaster, or if there is damage done, to be able to reduce that level of damage, or if they lose their ability to serve water or wastewater, that they'll be able to restore those operations quickly. There are tens of thousands of water and wastewater utilities around the country that face all sorts of disasters, hazards, extreme events. We want to assist with that resiliency, and we want them to understand that the way that you can build resiliency is to look at vulnerabilities and then to identify measures that can mitigate those hazards.
We're here in Berwick to work on a resiliency pilot project to look at some of the vulnerabilities and ways to mitigate those vulnerabilities, in this case, flooding.
We had two 100-year floods, one year and one the next year. It was totally unexpected. And the second one came with little warning.
Over the past 2 days, we've conducted an on-site vulnerability assessment for the Berwick Water Department and their water treatment plant, their storage system, their intake system, and their distribution system.
So what we're hoping to do is give them some standard things that they can do, some checklists that they can work through, and vulnerabilities that they can look for in their water systems to try and come up with some sort of mitigation measures.
Increasing your utility's resilience to flooding will help you become better prepared for and prevent damage from future flooding events, especially considering that climate change impacts could result in more frequent and more intense flooding. You can assess your current resilience to flooding and improve your ability to reduce impacts by following these 4 steps. Understanding the threat of flooding. by evaluating the likelihood and the potential severity of flooding at your utility, identifying vulnerable assets and determining consequences, by assessing critical operations and equipment that may be disabled or damaged by flooding, identifying and evaluating mitigation measures, by considering actions that will protect your utility from future flooding, and developing a plan to implement mitigation measures, by prioritizing cost-effective mitigation measures and scheduling completion.
First and foremost, one of the things we recommend to water systems to do is get to know their local emergency manager, because that's going to be the key to opening up state and federal funds to help avoid damage from future storms.
I'd be implementing some planning right away and some low-cost alternatives right away, and then looking at the big budget picture for other things.
We're encouraging utilities to not wait for a disaster because it's much more costly after a disaster to restore operations, and people's health and welfare are at stake.
Think ahead. Make plans now. Reduce the risk, and you'll be happy in the end.
EPA has many products to help utilities assess their vulnerabilities and go through this process themselves. Get started today at water.
Apologies, I think I cut off the last second there. But this is just to get you started thinking about some of the hazards that your utility might face, and flooding is one example of that, as we've seen some extreme flooding events over the last decade. So this is one resource we have, is a flood resilience guide. There's also a power resilience guide to address that interdependency that many water utilities have on local power plants. And there's also an earthquake resilience guide, which is probably not the most useful resource for you all, but just to mention, we have that as well. So now we're going to move on to what kinds of funding are available, as just again an overview before we really get into the nitty-gritty here. So the grant funding that is stated in the law in Section 2013 has not been provided to the Water Security Division. The funds haven't been appropriated by Congress, so we have not been able to establish a grant. However, there are options for water systems to use to access funding through the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund program. And these funds can be used to conduct a risk assessment since it addresses the resiliency of the system, and the risk assessment may yield a project that the utility decides they would like to invest in to improve the overall, again, resiliency of the system. So each state is different, and you'll have to check in with your state representative to see if they have set aside funds for this function specifically. And if we have any state primacy agency representatives in the audience, if you'd be interested in sharing what the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund might look like in your state, that would be very helpful. But again, if you're willing to do that, please write into the question chat box, and then we'll open up your mic in just a minute. So this is just some notes on enforcement. EPA's main goal is returning the system to compliance, or ensuring that a water system is compliant, and protecting public health. So Safe Drinking Water Act Section 1414 is the enforcement provision EPA can invoke to address an owner-operator of a public water system's non-compliance with an applicable requirement. Please note, because this question comes up a lot, that given the ongoing COVID-19 situation, EPA did release a COVID-19 enforcement discretion memo. Section E of this memo covers enforcement related to the Safe Drinking Water Act. So again, AWIA Section 2013 falls under the Safe Drinking Water Act, so you'd find the information there. But EPA doesn't have the authority to change the statutory deadlines, and they are the same. But for your awareness, you can find the link to this EPA enforcement discretion memo in your resources document. So now we're going to just test your understanding. AWIA Section 2013 is an amendment to the Clean Water Act, true or false? Okay, so we had sort of mixed results here. So AWIA Section 2013 is an amendment to the Safe Drinking Water Act. So commonly you'll see it as SDWA. And that's useful, you know, if you're looking at some of the legal requirements under there, but this is generally a trick question because they sound pretty similar. So AWIA Section 2013 is an amendment to the Safe Drinking Water Act, just to reiterate. And then this is to test your understanding about a not trick question. So your utility serves a population size of 4,000. Are you required to certify completion of your risk assessment? So this is a hypothetical question. Okay, great. Let's see what everyone said. Yes, 96% said yes, so that is correct. So if your system serves more than 3,300 people, then you are required to comply. So I'm glad that's clear. And the last one for this section, if your utility is a combined water system, does your AWIA compliant risk assessment have to cover the drinking water and wastewater side of the operation? Okay, awesome. Yeah, we asked this question here so we can address it more directly. So AWIA Section 2013 does not apply to wastewater systems. It only applies to drinking water systems. So that being said, your AWIA compliant risk assessment could address just one part of your water system, the drinking water side. But how you do your risk assessment is up to you. So you can include a combined system in your risk assessment as long as it meets the 6 requirements under AWIA Section 2013. So we'll get into that more, but just to start off with, AWIA Section 2013 only applies to drinking water systems and not wastewater systems. Okay, so that's the broad overview of Section 2013. Now we're going to move on to discussing the risk and resilience assessment. So how does a risk assessment help your utility? You know, there's many ways and they depend on your specific utility, but in general, you don't know what you don't know. So a risk assessment can help to identify those risks specific to your utility that you may not have been aware of, or maybe weren't completely aware of the impact they would have in terms of financial impact to the utility or on the community. So knowing the types of risks and potential for those risks is crucial for developing plans to prepare. For natural disasters, using data for your area to determine the likelihood of earthquakes, floods, and droughts is one way to understand your risks. And then just in general, once you know all your risks, you can put measures in place to mitigate them and to make your utility more resilient. And as well, the value of the risk assessment is also to help you prioritize the projects you'll invest in at your utility. So once you understand all the risks, it really will give you a cost-benefit analysis that you can look at and say, you know, this doesn't cost that much, but it will benefit our utility way more maybe than you had initially thought if there was a flood or a hurricane or something like that. So those are some of the ways a risk assessment would help. So that being said, it is required under Section 2013, and these are the 6 requirements under that section. So an assessment, a risk and resilience assessment, should include the risk to the system from malevolent acts and natural hazards, the resilience of the pipes and constructed conveyances, water collection, intake, pre-treatment, treatment, etc. You can see the list on your screen there. The monitoring practices of the system. So examples of monitoring practices may include sensors, laboratory resources, sampling capabilities, and data management equipment and systems. It also includes the financial infrastructure of the system. So this could be billing, payment, and accounting systems, as well as third parties used for those services. As well, so use storage or handling of various chemicals by the system. So an example could be storage facilities and handling practices used for chemical disinfection and treatment. So assessments under this asset category should focus on the risk of uncontrolled release of a potentially dangerous chemical like chlorine. It also includes operation and maintenance of the system. So that might include equipment, supplies, and key personnel. As well, the assessment may include an evaluation of capital and operational needs for risk and resilience management for the system. The risk assessment should also consider and address risks at any consecutive system that could impact the water system. So we've already talked a lot about resiliency and making a utility more resilient, but what exactly does that mean? So here we're talking about the ability of a system to adapt or withstand the effects of a malevolent act or natural hazard without interruption to the asset or system's function, or, you know, if that system is condition. So this is an important definition just to keep in mind if ever, you know, you're just like, what are you really talking about? This is what we mean when we say resilience and for the risk and resilience assessment. As we continue in our workshop, we're going to review the vulnerability self-assessment tool referred to as VSAT, and this includes a resilience indicator that will assist you in measuring your system's resilience. So we have resilience and now we have risk. So what is risk? Some of you may have seen this equation before, and it requires estimating 3 parameters. So it requires estimating the consequences, which are the public health and economic consequences resulting from the impact of a malevolent act or natural hazard on the facility. It also requires assessing vulnerability, which is a probability that the malevolent act will have an adverse impact on the facility, and it requires estimating threat likelihood. So this is the annual probability that a perpetrator will attempt to carry out the malevolent act against the facility. So these 3 parameters allow us to analyze the water system's risks. So risk equals consequences times vulnerability times threat likelihood. And so we're going to take that equation a step further and use the risk analysis and management for critical asset protection process, also known as the RAMCAP 7-step process, for analyzing and managing risk in the framework that is being applied in the AWIA J100 standard, as well as the baseline threat document, which we will review shortly. So step 1 here is asset characterization, which is determining which assets are the most critical in order to understand the assets that, if compromised, could result in prolonged or widespread service interruption, injuries, fatalities, detrimental economic impact, or any combination thereof. So when you're thinking about asset characterization, you're going to start with the question, what assets do I have and which are critical. You know, and by critical, you really want to focus on those that would make your system inoperable and result in, you know, major health impacts or the shut off of a water supply. So really focusing on critical assets and not all assets that your utility may have. So step 2, after you've identified those assets, is threat characterization. And so that's identifying the threats and hazards your utility might face based on the frequency of natural events, man-made events, dependency and proximity hazards, paired with the assets identified. So that question would be, what threats and hazards should I consider? Step 3 is the consequence analysis. So determining the worst reasonable consequence for each threat asset pair. For example, what is the highest number of people who may suffer fatality or become seriously injured if an identified threat were able to impact the critical assets of the facility? So consequence analysis, you know, how much money is lost, how many lives are lost, how many injuries. So really asking those hard questions and thinking of the worst reasonable consequence. Step 4 is the vulnerability analysis, the process of estimating the probability of the resulting consequences if a certain hazard occurred. In the case of a malevolent act or attack, it would be the probability that an attack would successfully result in an estimated number of fatalities or serious injury. What are the vulnerabilities that a system might have that would allow such an attack to be successful? And then step 5 would be threat analysis. So determining the probability that a threat will occur in a year, the calculations for each of the threat categories based on different factors. So for example, for malevolent attacks, the analysis is based on the adversary's objectives, capabilities, and attractiveness of a specific facility relative to alternative targets. For natural hazards, the analysis is based on historical records for the specific location of the asset and future trends. We also have dependency hazards, which is based on local historical records for the frequency, severity, and duration of service denials. So one example of a dependency hazard is a water utility's reliance on the supply chain. For proximity hazards, it's based on local situation and historical records for the frequency, severity, and duration of service denials. So that's step 5, and now we're going to move on to step 6, which is the actual risk resilience analysis. So this is a calculation of your current level of risk and resilience based on the products from step 3. So consequences, step 4, the vulnerability analysis, and step 5, your threat analysis. Step 7 is the risk and resilience management, where you decide what actions you might need to take to reduce your risk and increase resilience. So you'll want to analyze the costs associated with those actions and identify the best cost-benefit ratio. And this is the process used to analyze risk that we're going to introduce you to today. So the RAMCAP 7-step process. So here's just a quick knowledge check. What is the risk equation? Great, yeah, they're both similar, but the answer is that risk equals consequences times vulnerability times threat likelihood. So that's the formula we're going to be using today. So now we're going to go over what are the steps to complete the risk and resilience assessment. So now that you know the basic requirements and some of the definitions we're talking about, we're going to really get started. In general, the process to conduct the risk assessment could take up to 6 months for larger utilities, but it can also take much less time depending on the size of your utility and the way that you organize your process. So today we're going to go over one potential method of conducting a risk and resilience assessment, just understanding that there are alternative ways to do it, and we're just presenting one that has worked for some water utilities. So step one would be to identify a lead. So someone who has control and ownership of the process. And this is important when it comes to meeting, you know, the compliance deadline and making sure all parts of the assessment are completed. So this might be you, or this might be your boss. But your utility could choose different people. It's up to you based on your organizational structure. Some utilities have chosen the security manager and others have chosen the safety lead. But we've made this process simple enough that you can take care of it in-house. So step two would be to build a team of key personnel who will provide the necessary information about the system. And it should include personnel from each specific section in the organization to ensure that the process is well informed. So that could include someone from operations, maintenance, human resources, budgeting, contracting. You know, for smaller utilities, one person might have several jobs, but again, it's building a team that makes sense for your organizational structure. Once you have a team, you'll need to hold a meeting. You might want to start a workshop process, which is what some utilities have done, or you might want to take advantage of a standing organizational meeting that already includes key personnel. And so during that meeting, you'll inform them of the background we just covered and the purpose of the exercise, which would be the risk and resilience assessment. Step three would be to identify critical assets. We touched on this a little bit, but another way of thinking of it is to think of what makes the system inoperable. So not every asset is critical. And it's an essential step in the process because it will ensure that you don't end up with more than 20 asset threat pairs when you do your analysis. So we do ask that you be deliberate with this discussion in excluding non-critical assets. And so you can start by defining a specific asset that is at risk, and that could be the asset category itself. So for example, physical barriers, or it could be a piece of equipment at the facility, a storage tank, or it could be an entire system. But step three, once you have your lead, you have your team, you're going to want to identify those critical assets that would make your system inoperable. And then now step four is to take a look at the malevolent acts that could impact your utility's critical assets. And at this point, we're going to go over a tool we have to assist you in doing this. And it's called the Baseline Information on Malevolent Acts Relevant to Community Water Systems. And this document was required by law to be developed by EPA to assist utilities in identifying the malevolent acts of highest risk to their utility. It's a free resource that's in PDF format on EPA's website, and we'll ensure that everyone has the link to the document. I believe it's in the resource document, but also in the email you'll receive. So the purpose of the Baseline Threat for Malevolent Acts document is to assist community water systems in identifying the types of malevolent acts that could impact community water systems and assist community water systems with estimating the threat likelihood. So in order to cover the types of malevolent acts that can occur, the Baseline Threat document pulls from the AWIA J110 standard for risk and resilience management of water and wastewater systems, which provides an extensive set of malevolent threat scenarios. These scenarios were adapted for water systems from that RAMCAP methodology, and that methodology was developed by the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, later endorsed by the Department of Homeland Security. It's an all-hazard and resilience management process for critical infrastructure. The J100 scenarios include physical assaults launched from the air, land, or water, cyber attacks, intentional contamination, sabotage, and theft. In addition, the appendices to this document includes natural hazard threats. So how does the document help you? Well, I think I mentioned this, but just to reiterate, it helps to estimate the likelihood of malevolent threats your facility may face. And this can be difficult to do for a number of reasons. One being that physical attacks and intentional contamination incidents at water utilities do not occur frequently enough to establish, any sense of likelihood based on historic frequency. So it's unlike a hurricane where you can look at the past decade and say it happened X number of times. Physical attacks do not occur frequently enough and are more randomized, so that can be hard to estimate. As well, vandalism and theft occur more frequently than physical attacks and contamination, but most systems don't have the data to estimate the likelihood that their utility will be targeted. And although the intelligence and law enforcement agencies have information to identify patterns of criminal activity, these sources don't focus on the likelihood of these types of incidents occurring at water utilities. So this basically tries to make the threat likelihood specific to community water systems and look at the frequency that it might happen specific to community water systems. So this document assists you in limiting the number of malicious acts that community water system must address. So to do that, the document has grouped several individual malicious acts into broader categories, basically to simplify the process. So on the next slide, I'll show you an excerpt from the document to demonstrate how the groups were developed. The document also provides the threat likelihood estimates for community water systems to use as a starting point when calculating the likelihood of a malevolent act at their facility. And the basis of this calculation is provided in the background information. So the methodology and where these numbers came from is in the background section of this document. The document also asks questions concerning general and threat-specific factors to help utilities determine if the threat likelihood at their respective utility is increased or decreased. Finally, the document provides a list of available resources to assist the utility in finding out additional information about malevolent acts. So this slide here is a depiction of Table 6 from the baseline information document. And it covers the threat category for assault on utility physical. So you can see here that the AWWA J110 scenarios have been grouped into this one threat category, and they're listed on the left. So the AWWA J110 standards are those that say aircraft, assault team, maritime, vehicle-borne bomb, directed, contamination of product. And this document combines those into one threat category, assault on utility physical. And then on the right, you'll see the calculated threat likelihood for water and wastewater utilities. And there's also questions that make this threat likelihood specific to your water utility. So those would include things like, do you have access, strict access control at your facility? So you'll answer yes or no. It might also ask, are there physical barriers to impede unauthorized access? So your answers to those questions will modify the default threat likelihood. If you answer yes to most of the questions, will indicate a decreased risk for the threat category. If you answer no for most of the questions, then your system might be at an elevated risk for this threat category, and you may want to use this threat to pair with your critical assets in your ultimate risk and resilience assessment. So that's the process for identifying malevolent acts with that document that is in your resources handout. As well, there's then you'll want to identify natural hazards. You have malevolent acts, and now you're identifying the natural hazards that are of greatest threat to your facility. And if you've already conducted a vulnerability assessment or risk assessment, you can start there. You've probably identified these natural hazards already. As a next step, you can also check your local hazard mitigation plan. So many state and local governments have existing hazard mitigation plans, which summarize the overall strategy for a community to reduce losses and break the cycle of recurring damage. The mitigation plan typically summarizes each hazard. It sets clear goals for being disaster resilient and identifies a list of appropriate mitigation actions. So you don't necessarily need to start from scratch here. You know, looking at your past assessments, seeing if the local authorities or the state has an existing plan, and then really making it specific to your water utility. And if, you know, your state or local emergency management agency doesn't have a hazard mitigation plan, they often have a response plan, and that information may already be identified in there. Are there other ways? So this is a question for you all. Are there other ways that you may be able to obtain this information, or a way that has been particularly useful for your water utility to identify natural hazards or malevolent acts? So please write that in, and I'll read some in just a minute. So while you're typing in any additional things that might help you identify those threats, I'm going to review the next step, which would be to create the asset threat pairs. So if you were following our suggested implementation process, this is where you would create those asset threat pairs and start your vulnerability self-assessment analysis. So as a team, you work together to basically take your critical assets you identified initially and then pair them with the most consequential malevolent acts and natural hazard threats. And that's going to create your asset threat pair. So you'll hear this a lot, but when we say asset threat pair, we mean those critical assets you identified in step 3, pairing with those malevolent acts and natural hazards that you identified in step 4 and 5. And you will want to limit the number of asset threat pairs that are subjected to a full quantitative risk assessment to no more than 10 to 12. This is an option for medium systems, and ideally fewer than 6. You want to focus on the very highest risk threats and the most consequential assets. And then in answer to our question of other ways to identify information on threats, Bradley Perrin mentioned just to really review previous assessments and then analyze new modified systems since that update, and that is great advice. Definitely want to reiterate that. So thanks for that comment, Bradley. So here's another knowledge check. What document does US EPA provide to assist you in assessing malevolent acts at your utility? And another person, Travis, mentioned that reviewing their ERP will show threats. And that's accurate, definitely. Okay, yeah, so that is, this shows most people have followed along. So to identify malevolent acts, the EPA developed the baseline information on malevolent acts relevant to community water system documents. But just so you all know, those other documents listed as options are real documents that the Water Security Division provides. So we do have a power resilience guide, we have that route to resilience guide, and we have many incident action checklists. But option C is the only one that is specific to malevolent acts. So what factor of the risk equation does the baseline information on malevolent acts document provide? Great, yeah. So most of you got it. It's threat likelihood. So I'll just reiterate for those in case it wasn't clear. So the purpose of that baseline malevolent acts document is to identify the types of malevolent acts that could impact community water systems and assist those systems with estimating the threat likelihood. So that document is relevant when you're looking at malevolent acts, and it helps you estimate the threat likelihood of those acts for your community water system. And then what plans can assist you in identifying potential natural hazards? Awesome, yeah, they're the hazard mitigation plans that your local or state agency might have. So it shouldn't be too big of a lift if you use the state mandated emergency response plan mixed with any existing hazard mitigation plans to determine your some threats that might impact your water utility. So with that being said, we're going to go on a 15-minute break, and when we come back, we will look at the vulnerability self-assessment tool.
Before we break, Victoria, we actually have a question from an attendee.
Okay.
Robert, you can now unmute and ask your question.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, I thought I heard real quickly, what is the responsibility for consecutive systems? Is that on the primary system, or do consecutive systems have to do this on their own?
Yeah, so if the consecutive system serves a population of 3,301 or greater, they will also be required to comply. But the requirements on the primary system is just to think of risks that might be posed to them from that consecutive system. So for instance, if you purchase water from a wholesaler, you know that you're incorporating the risk that maybe the water source is contaminated or something like that. So you're not responsible for creating a risk assessment for that consecutive system, but thinking of how you might be impacted by it, if that makes sense.
Yep, no, excellent, thank you.
Very welcome. Okay.
And then we have one more question. So Jeffrey asked, what if the information you need to make your assessment is not available or does not exist? Maybe do you have any tips for how to find information for your risk assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to go through this vulnerability self-assessment. And when you do that, you'll see that you're able to put in your zip code. And this tool will actually show the historic frequency of these natural events, for instance, a hurricane or flood in your specific community. It also provides you with some economic data that might be useful. And then that baseline threat document is definitely useful in identifying malevolent acts. So these two tools, one of which we haven't yet gone over, will provide a baseline you can use, along with some other things that FEMA has developed, such as you know, their flood guides and their hurricane guides as well. Yeah.
Great, wonderful, and that is all the questions.
Wonderful. So we will return in 15 minutes at 9:25. Thank you.